Hi, Chris Good here. This is another lecture essentials video, and this is for the week 6. We're talking about psychotherapeutic drugs, including those to treat depression and to treat psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. So we're going to talk about antidepressants and antipsychotics. Okay, briefly, on mental disorders, really we're only going to be talking about the mood disorders, specifically depressive disorders and the schizophrenias. So mood disorders are characterized by either depressed or manic symptoms. These are sort of opposite poles of how you're feeling. On the low side, major depressive disorder is one. People may have oscillating depression with episodes of mania, and that doesn't mean they go crazy. It means that their mood is elevated. It's up. They actually feel really positive. This is called bipolar disorder, and if people have this oscillating mood going from high to low, that's bipolar, and that's not necessarily treated with antidepressant drugs. There are some other medications that we're not going to talk about here. The thing is, though, that when you see somebody with a mental disorder, they really never fit nicely into a little box. And that goes for people with schizophrenia as well as major depressive disorder, anxiety, bipolar, etc. The main thing that most of you are probably already familiar with is the monoamine theory of depression, whether you know it's called that or not. And this has to do with systems like serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine being involved in problems with mood. And there's a couple of pieces of evidence that support this theory of mood disorders. So the monoamine theory of depression started with this drug called reserpine. Reserpine, in a chemical sense, irreversibly blocks monoamine vesicular uptake. Monoamine neurotransmitters are those like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. It acts on transporters involved in monoamine uptake all over the body, though. And so it lowers your blood pressure. It also produces nausea and vomiting and ulcers. And in a minority of patients, it can induce depression. So this prevents It prevents packaging in the vesicles of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, and reserpine makes people sad. This guy in the picture isn't sad, he's just thinking, but there you go. It's also a horse sedative, and it's much more likely to induce the kind of depression that responds well to these newer classes of antidepressant drugs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and the serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, which we'll talk about in a second. The second piece of evidence that suggests that neurotransmitters like serotonin might be involved in depression is this. The first antidepressant drug is it was a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and we'll talk about what that does in a second. It was developed to treat tuberculosis, and it makes people happy. So we gave this to people to treat their tuberculosis, and in some of them, not all of them, but in some of them, they responded with this elevated mood. They felt inexplicably happy. Now, the monoamine theory of depression is vastly oversimplified. If you go to www.prozac.com, they'll tell you that people who are depressed have an imbalance in serotonin in their brain. There's no direct evidence of this. You cannot measure quantifiable differences in serum serotonin between people who are depressed and people who aren't. And there just is very little direct evidence that the problem is not enough serotonin. And there's another piece of evidence that sort of works against this idea as well. We'll talk about that in a second. But all antidepressant drugs currently act in some way on the monoamine systems. We talked about that first antidepressant drug, the iproniazid, that is in the class of monoamine oxidase inhibitors. The tricyclic and heterocyclic antidepressants like Elavil and norepinephrine and Aventil, those inhibit the reuptake of norepinephrine and serotonin and dopamine. You guys probably already know about the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil. And there are newer antidepressant drugs that block the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine selectively and not so much dopamine. There's another drug, bupropion or Wellbutrin, and that's a selective dopamine reuptake inhibitor and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. So let's go into the synapse and talk about how these things might work. All right. So here's our synapse, and you can see the transporters down here. So, but in the synapse, there are also neurotransmitter molecules that are being taken apart by these little blue things, right? These little blue boomerang-shaped things, and those are enzymes that are breaking down transmitter to stop the neurotransmission signal or to end it so that you can get another signal started. So those enzymes include monoamine oxidase. So monoamine oxidase breaks down monoamines like norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. And when you block the breakdown, it means there's more of that transmitter left in the synapse to send that signal for a longer period of time. Similarly, if you're blocking this lighter blue transporter that is grabbing neurotransmitter molecules and taking them back up into the presynaptic neuron that's releasing them, that also shuts down signaling. If you're blocking that, then more transmitter, and if it's one of the tricyclic or heterocyclic antidepressants, more norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine are staying in these synapses for a longer period of time. Of course, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors block the transporter for serotonin more selectively. Okay. So the fact that having more serotonin in the synapse for a longer period of time, along with these other two monoamine neurotransmitters, suggests that, well, maybe there is a serotonin insufficiency in people who are depressed. But you can't measure it in any of the disorders that respond well to SSRI treatment, not in depression or OCD or panic disorder, and all of these are being treated with antidepressant drugs, generalized anxiety disorder, even premenstrual syndrome, and they're suggesting that it might work on autism and anorexia and migraine headaches and things like that. The problem with this is that we really don't know how these antidepressant drugs are working. If it were a simple matter of just getting serotonin into the synapse, well, that happens immediately. As soon as you take your Prozac, you block the transporter and you get more serotonin in the synapse, and you would think that would make you happy if it were an imbalance in the serotonin and you just needed more of it. But it doesn't work that fast. You block the transporter and you're going to get more serotonin in there in about 20 minutes after you take the pill. That doesn't work to treat depression. It usually takes about 2 weeks. Physicians will encourage you to keep trying the same dose for about 4 weeks. After 6 weeks, they may adjust your dose, but keep you on the same drug even if you haven't responded, if your symptoms haven't responded to Prozac treatment. So, the other problem is that when you do that, you are exposing all these different types of serotonin receptors to more serotonin, and that includes ones that act on other neurotransmitter systems, because there may be a neuron that expresses this type of serotonin 2A or B type of receptor that itself releases dopamine from its terminals, or glutamate or acetylcholine. I should say that 5-HT here is the chemical abbreviation for serotonin. It's 5-hydroxytryptamine, and we'll come back to that in just a second. These are all the different types of serotonin receptors we knew about, some 10-15 years ago, and there were 15 different types of receptors then. There's probably more that we know about now. But like I said, when these are expressed in postsynaptic cells, those postsynaptic cells themselves may release other transmitters at the end of their axons, like dopamine, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, etc. So when serotonin receptor, for example, this one, the serotonin 1A receptor is expressed in a dopamine neuron. Serotonin inhibits the release of dopamine. When the serotonin receptor type 3 is expressed in a dopamine neuron, binding serotonin increases the release of dopamine. And remember, you're exposing all of these to more serotonin, so you're both increasing and inhibiting the release of dopamine and acetylcholine and glutamate, and other systems are affected as well. I mean, when you take this pill, you get increased serotonin in the synapse all over the brain. Okay, well, if it's not the case that more serotonin is better, how do antidepressant drugs work? Well, maybe it's the fact that they're correcting the balance of the neurotransmitter and the receptor. All right, so let's go back to our synapse. Here's the receptors for serotonin down here, right? When they bind, something happens in the postsynaptic cell when they bind serotonin. And this postsynaptic cell is not going to just sit there and take all this extra serotonin in the synapse hanging out for a longer and longer period of time. It's just not going to happen. It's going to respond by adjusting the number of receptors over a prolonged period of time. And recent data from mouse models of depression that responds to selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor treatment suggests that over prolonged exposure to the drug, the number of postsynaptic receptors here in a couple of areas in the brain that we know to be affected by depression decrease the number of receptors. These receptors decrease in number. So fewer serotonin receptors. And guess how long it takes to do that? About 2 to 4 weeks. The same time course as the therapeutic effect of the drug. So one other explanation of how antidepressant drugs work is, well, maybe it's not that we need more serotonin. Maybe it's that we need fewer serotonin receptors. And it takes time to get that balance. So balance more serotonin plus fewer receptors, and that's when you get the therapeutic effect. There are other things that happen. Remember, there's lots of different types of serotonin receptors. Some things that occur postsynaptically downstream of more serotonin that takes about 2 to 4 weeks include the expression of these neurotrophins, these chemicals that promote the growth and survival of neurons, and we say that they're neuroprotective. And this is something else that happens postsynaptically, and we can see this in an animal model where these compounds are increased in number about 2 to 4 weeks after you start treatment of Prozac. Now, there are other things that happen, and if you really press your doctor and your doctor says, well, we think you have depression, we want you to take these drugs for 4 to 6 weeks or so to see what happens, see if your mood improves. If you really ask your physician, hey, how do these really work? They can give you the story about serotonin and you need more of it, and you can say, well, I took a class and it turns out it's not that simple. They'll say, well, yeah, you're right. We're correcting the balance of the transmitter and receptor, but if you really press a physician, they'll admit that we don't really know for sure in humans how this works. It's probably a whole bunch of different things. And remember, when you take that drug, you're affecting serotonin receptors all over the brain connected to all these different types of transmitter systems. Let me throw one last thing in here to confuse you guys. There's a new antidepressant called tianeptine, which is not a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's a selective serotonin reuptake enhancer. It actually enhances the reuptake of serotonin. It does have antidepressant qualities, and people respond on about the same time course as they do with the SSRIs. So that's tianeptine. Couple last things. Depression actually responds very well to placebo treatment. And remember, all behavior has a physiological basis, including the placebo effect. The placebo effect is not psychological, meaning it has no physiological basis. It does. In fact, if you look at brain scans, you can see changes in activity in people who are depressed who respond to Prozac, and you see changes in the same regions of the brain, changes in activity over about 6 weeks in people who are responding to the placebo. Now, you don't see brain activity changes in all the same places, but you do see it in similar places. And in this slide, changes in brain activity that are highlighted in yellow here. You see changes in these brain regions that are either increases or decreases that are shared by both placebo responders and Prozac responders. So it's very difficult to show that your antidepressant drug is any better than a placebo, since people respond very well to placebo treatment. Okay, we're going to break in the middle of this presentation, and we're going to talk about schizophrenia in part 2 of this week's material.